Welcome, my YouTube friends. Rose of Dawn responded to Kat Blaque, "What is a trans activist?" Given that Rose of Dawn herself is a turfy piece of shit, I'm really curious to see her answer. Let's find out. Rose of Dawn, take it away.
A few weeks ago, I made a video entitled Femboys versus Trans Activists, where I discussed how the trap or femboy community found itself attacked by trans people online and felt pressured into coming out as being trans. Now, the video itself was fairly well received, but going through the comments, I came across quite a familiar name. Do you recognise who this is? Well, that's Kat Blaque, who is a YouTuber, public speaker, and self-described not an activist. Her videos mostly relate to social justice issues, so if you followed the skeptic community all those years ago, you no doubt came across her in multiple videos. Now, let me read you her critique of my video, because I find it quite interesting. She said, "So here's my big issue with these conversations. Who are these trans activists, and what activism have they done? Are they simply people who claim to be trans hiding behind anime avatars on Twitter? Who exactly are the activists telling tomboys they're actually trans? Are they people who, upon looking back at their own lives where they identified as tomboys and part of that was them figuring themselves out, just putting a voice to that particular narrative? I don't think anyone who gets to tell anyone who they are, including people who argue that because people don't experience dysphoria in the same way you do, they aren't trans. My biggest point is, who really cares? Seriously, who cares? And why should I care if someone who lives and experiences gender differently than I do also identifies as trans? This discourse seems very online, and I'm not going to negate the importance of online spaces for trans folks as someone who's facilitated several of them, but I'm curious about the real world implications and why these distinctions are so incredibly important to some people. I can't help but recognise that while some people try to make these distinctions, we are all the same in the eyes of transphobes, so I don't particularly see the value in fighting to make these distinctions. Is a femboy actually better at their gender because they try harder to pass, as you say? I'm confused by the point here. Most trans women who take issue with traps take issues less with the people themselves and more with the idea that trans people exist to fool and trick men. And men who are interested in trans women really don't make a huge distinction between a hyper-feminine trap and a trans woman. Like I said, this seems very online. I don't particularly have an issue with a hyper-feminine man describing themselves as some flavour of trans. I also don't have an issue with them saying they're definitely not trans. I don't really see the harm either way. Now, Kat followed this up with a tweet basically summarising her point. Not every trans woman with a social media account is a trans activist. Judging from the timing and some of the responses, I believe this was likely aimed at me. Now, I actually think this is a point where
Yeah. I think this is something that a trap a lot of people fall into, no pun intended, that people think trans people are, by their nature, activists and advocates, and that they should be activists and advocates. I've even seen allies with this attitude. And I think that that's wrong. Just because you have experience being trans doesn't mean that you are fully up on the arguments, or that you're even capable or willing to engage with those arguments in a public social media way. Or other more effective activism, such as protesting or calling Congress people, what have you. So, yeah, I 100% agree with Kat Blaque on that. And I'm guessing from the way she started that Rose of Dawn is going to agree with her as well. So I'm really curious where she goes with this.
Worth clarifying. But before I do so, I just want to make it clear that this is in no way an attempt to start drama with a bigger YouTube channel and is not intended as a personal attack on Kat Blaque. At the very least, her comment wasn't rude to me, and I don't intend to be rude back to her. Now, I'm going to address most of the points Kat's raised, but I should point out that her argument on whether people claiming to be trans but not having dysphoria causes harm or not has already been addressed in many of my videos, and I don't really fancy repeating myself, but if you want more of an understanding on what my position is and why I think that this actually does cause harm, you should check out the video Transsexuals v Gender Radicals, which is one of the first videos that I ever made. Now, first of all, I should note that Kat is seemingly skeptical of anyone who says that they are trans and uses an online avatar as though they might be faking it. But this goes against the general trans mantra we've become accustomed to.
No, it doesn't. So, the reason why it doesn't is because you have to look at... Anyone can make a Twitter account, create a Pi Crew avatar, and claim that they're a transgender, lesbian, panromantic, whatever. They can do that. Anyone could. I could do that. But you can generally tell by the arguments, by the content they put on that channel, on that Twitter account, whether they're authentic or not. Sometimes you can't, but the reason why you can't just assume just because they come out and say that it's true is because you have to look at the consequences of their argument. And while I would never publicly deny someone's identity, I will deny someone as an activist if they're not creating good outcomes. Just because we say if you identify as trans, you're trans, doesn't mean that you have that you're an activist, that you have a voice or arguments that are worth listening to. I mean, right?
Over the last few years. According to the trans lobby, the only criteria needed to be trans is simply just to self-identify, and the kind of accounts Kat is referring to meet just that. So who is she to really say that these accounts cannot be trans? Would this not be considered gatekeeping? Something the community sees as so problematic that they label those who support it, like myself and Blair White, as transphobic, self-hating true scum? Kat also complains about how this debate is very online.
The difference is that we would still label an anime avatar or Pi Crew avatar spouting transphobic, turfy nonsense as turfy transphobes. Like, we have no problem doing that. Even if we accept their identity as trans, we can still make arguments against them. And if they're making bad arguments and they still claim to be activists, then they're bad fucking activists.
Seemingly as a way of dismissing anything which looks a little crazy. But to a lot of the general public, the battle for neo-pronouns, hundreds of genders, intersectionality and so on and so forth are also online issues, and these are topics that Kat herself advocates for. So can these just be as easily dismissed as well? But the red flag for me, and the purpose of this video, is the following line. Who are these trans activists, and what activism have they done? Now, Kat is getting hung up on terminology here, but let's address it. What is a trans activist, and is activist actually the right term? Well, anyone who's been watching my channel since it began might recognise a phrase I used in my early videos, which is gender radicals, that being people who push a radical transgender ideology, and the radicals have 5 signifiers to help identify them, which are as follows. There are many genders. Biological sex is a construct. Smash the binary. Don't assume someone's gender, and all of this is accompanied by left-wing politics.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this yesterday. Most of those are good, except that gender is a social construct, and sex is mostly an accident of biology that doesn't actually have little or anything to do with gender. So, you're wrong here.
You can use any term you like here, trans activist, gender radical, SJW, but it just differentiates between someone pushing a particular narrative and a generic trans person who either has little interest in the above or outright opposes it. But I hear the smart aleck type in the comments, an activist has a proper definition, Rose, and that is someone who pushes for societal change and in a variety of different ways, whether online or in the streets. I can bet these would be the same people who would be offended at the idea that the term woman has an actual dictionary definition as well, and would seek to ban it from the public space, as we've seen quite.
No, it's just that the Webster's definition lags behind the scientific and sociological definitions we have. This is the difference between prescriptive and descriptive. Dictionaries are descriptive. Science and sociological are prescriptive. Descriptive means it describes something. Prescriptive means that it prescribes, which is basically redefining it, restating the word. A prescriptive definition is something which is based on data and solid information. A descriptive definition is just something which describes something which already exists. Now, oftentimes, the descriptive definition is also prescriptive. But in this case, definitions like man or woman are not. Sorry.
Quite prominently in the last year. Now, really this is the core of Kat's arguments. These people aren't representative and are in no place to speak on behalf of the community. But before I do that, I just want to acknowledge that Kat's own grasp on what an activist is fairly lax at best. In the past, she has repeatedly distanced herself from that label, such as in this tweet sent in August 2019. I don't self-describe myself as an activist. Look at pretty much any place I've ever been the person to write my own description. I don't describe/call myself an activist, but Kat has quite clearly partook in activism work herself. For example, here's an article with Google where Kat, introduced as a trans activist by the way, was invited to talk about intersectional issues. Now Google isn't just a big company, but one of the most powerful corporations on the planet, and Kat has been invited onto panels at various public events to discuss the issues that are close to her heart. She also makes a notable amount of money from public speaking.
So I'm assuming that she calls herself, or she doesn't self-identify as an activist. And I don't know Kat Blaque that well. I haven't really engaged with her content that much. But from what I understand of her content is that she doesn't see herself mostly as an activist. She's kind of been pushed into that role. And obviously they're identifying her as such here, but she doesn't see that as her primary purpose. I don't know if she considers her primary purpose social commentary or education, information, what have you, but she's definitely more of a... that definitely seems to be more of her discussion, not so much an activist, just more of a commentator. That commentary can often be used towards activism, and obviously she's willing to do so and doesn't have much of an issue with being described that way, but she doesn't self-identify that way.
Her own advert describes her as an activist. And I should highlight a further tweet sent by Kat in 2018, where she just clarifies she is an activist, just not a Twitter activist. And her activism is apparently in video form and education, virtually and in person. Funnily enough, this was sent over a year before she distanced herself from her own label. Kat also has trouble sticking the activist label on others who, like it or not, may be considered activists themselves. Notably, in a video on the notorious tampon-loving horror show that is Jessica Yaniv, Kat bemoans online publications labelling Yaniv as a prominent activist. Now, Yaniv certainly wasn't prominent until reporting restrictions were lifted back in July of 2019, but the Crowder article she highlights in her video doesn't label Yaniv as prominent, something Yaniv has only really earned as time went on when he became the bulk of trans craziness.
You're citing louder with Crowder calling her an activist. Yeah, I'm betting he didn't have any kind of ulterior motive for calling Jessica Yaniv an activist. Yaniv has even less claim to the title of activist than I do, and I don't even pretend to have that title, or no one has ever tried to give that title to me. Jesus. Talk about bad faith. Yeah, exactly, Magma. When you use Crowder to make your point, you done fucked up.
Yes. Kat says that neither she nor her friends had heard of Yaniv, but that doesn't change the fact that Yaniv does see himself as an activist. Now, going back to the topic at hand, you can certainly argue that the action...
So I think this is a situation where we're running into... What's happening here is it seems like Rose of Dawn is taking the self-identification that pretty much every trans rights person, I don't want to say activist, because they're not all activists, but every forward-thinking person agrees with, including sociology, to say that if you self-identify as an activist, then you are, but you can also be identified as an activist, and then you also are an activist. That works for gender, not for activism. Just, again, we have to look at what they do. Someone can call themselves an activist, but if all they do is post on Twitter and maybe write for Medium once in a while, then are they really an activist? Or are they just, you know, a shit poster, a poster, as the phrase is? Because I would look at what Jessica Yaniv is doing and not call that activism. I would look at Kat Blaque, what Kat Blaque does, and probably call that activism. Now, out of respect for Kat Blaque, I would not call her an activist since that she doesn't claim that title openly. But I don't think it's hard to see the difference there. But you just think that since we can self-identify as a different gender, that whatever we self-identify as has material. No, outside of gender, it fucking doesn't.
Of online accounts, regardless of size, do count as a form of activism, and they have a real-world impact. Now, some people get paid by major corporations to inform policy, others get power in pride committees. They put pressure on politicians to get hate speech laws implemented, but most importantly, they contribute to...
No one on the... Well, I don't want to say no one, but most people I know on the left are not interested in hate speech legislation. Because we're not interested in giving the government power to decide what words and phrases you can and can't use. Because if we say, well, okay, if you call someone the F slur or the N-word or whatever, that's hate speech and you shouldn't do that, so yes, they can be prosecuted. Then it's very easy for someone like Trump to get in there and say that anyone who advocates for socialism is committing a hate crime. That solidarity is hate speech. That workers' rights or seize the means of production or eat the rich are hate crimes or hate speech. That's why we don't agree with hate speech legislation. This is the difference between legislation and agreeing with a company's ability to enforce terms of service.
And largely form the public perception of trans people as a whole. Social media such as Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube can...
Also, I think she's obliquely referencing Bill C-16 in Canada, which it has to be said, Canada does have hate speech legislation, whereas America doesn't. But even under Bill C-16, you would not be prosecuted... Actually, I think Jessica Yaniv could probably have a pretty solid case under Bill C-16 for bringing hate crime charges against you, Rose of Dawn, for constantly misgendering her. Because you're deliberately doing it to denigrate her. That's where Bill C-16 comes in. But if I accidentally referred to you as him in this video, which I wouldn't do, but occasionally I slip up because I try to talk a little faster than normal here so that it's a little more lively to listen to, then I wouldn't be guilty of anything under Bill C-16, even if I was under Canadian jurisdiction. But your constant misgendering of her as a way of denigrating her and impugning her very existence is potentially a hate crime, as I understand Bill C-16. It was just adding gender identity to the list of protected classes, of which cisgender heterosexual people were already members.
offer an unparalleled insight into public discourse, more so than letters to a newspaper or radio phone-ins. And unlike the vast majority of identity movements, the trans community has only come into prominence during the age of the internet, so there's a lot less control as to which voices are being heard. This doesn't mean that people on Twitter necessarily have their fingers on society's pulse, as the Labour Party under Corbyn painfully found out last December, but this doesn't negate the fact that companies and politicians do listen to them. And social media pile-ons, which are commonplace on Twitter, have resulted in backtracking, apologies, and even firings based on the lashing out of a tsunami of woke accounts. Whilst some of the accounts may indeed be anonymous, they don't pull talking points out of nowhere. One part of the criticism I received in my last video was that some of the tweets I used as examples didn't have a lot of feedback on them. But this doesn't remove the very real issue that I was talking about in that video, where some people who label themselves as traps or femboys have found themselves pressured into coming out as trans. And there are resources that are used by activists from within the trans community which back up the idea that a femboy must be trans.
No one in the trans community thinks femboys are trans. God, I feel like I keep having to say this. Maybe it's just Rose of Dawn's little fucking bubble. Femboys, unless they identify as trans, are not trans. Now, individual trans people may observe individual femboys' behavior and say, oh yeah, you're definitely an egg. You'll be on hormones and looking up gender reassignment or gender confirmation surgery in the next year or two, I guarantee it. But that's because they recognize behavior in themselves or they recognize behavior in that person that they engaged in themselves before they transitioned, before they recognized that they were trans. This is not some large-scale idea that, oh, if you're a femboy, then you're trans, you just don't realize it yet. Also, I never really noticed how feminine women were raindrops on and masculine men, cisgender. Jesus, this whole picture. The worst thing about this picture is that it's clearly aping like a Dr. Seuss style, which is fucking horrendous to me.
In my last video, I held up the transgender umbrella as an example of a notable source doing just that, but you also have the likes of the gender bread man or gender unicorn, which push a wide spectrum of gender.
Wait, what? What even is this? Okay, the spectrum of gender identity from Wait, no. Okay, I see what they did. I mean, I guess gender expression, okay. I guess I don't understand what, unless this is just as a model for showing the differences between these. But I don't. If that is its purpose, I think this is a good use of it. But I'm not sure what she's talking about here. What? What is it's pronounced metrosexual.com? Okay. Administered by Sam Killerman. Let's see. Literal transphobia. This isn't the kind of transphobia we publicly talk about, and its source isn't Fox News. Forthcoming book about dogmatic activism, which I'm currently publicly writing, is a new blog post every day on my personal blog. Okay. Bet the goal of most LGBTQ plus advocates, educators, and activists has never been to make people afraid of transgender people. If that has been your goal, these aren't the words you're looking for. You can go about your business and move along. For the rest of us, you might be able to relate to an annoyingly common experience I've had over the years. During a training or in some other sitting, someone would say something homophobic or transphobic. I'd point it out, say it's an example of homophobia or transphobia, then they'd reply, "No, I'm not afraid of gay people, I just..." then usually double down on their homophobic thing. I'll let you fill in the blank. Okay. Okay, so let me see. Okay. This takes a little introduction to understanding gender. So I dislike this biological or anatomical sex because this is one of those things that TERFs use to try to say that trans women are not real women if they still have a penis. Because they can literally be feminine in literally every other respect, but if they still have a penis, they're no longer women, or they're not women yet, or whatever bullshit terminology they use. 200 workshops, 3 years, and 1 book edition later, I'm happy to finally publish my 4th version of the Genderbread Person. Okay. Way down below, a bit of my rationale on how to make changes to the cookie, but here's one thing I don't say there that makes more sense here. This version of the Genderbread Person workshop tests tweaked for quite a while, where I published it almost entirely queer and mostly trans educators, feedbackers. It's pronounced metrosexual seems pretty good. Result for that process and reflects something that isn't perfect, but it's an improvement upon 3.x, a forever work in progress, and the best me and the people providing me constructive criticism could do right now. Okay. Identity does not equal expression, does not equal sex, gender does... Yeah, right. This change was in hindsight a gimme. It's something that no fewer than 1,000 of you emailed me requesting. It's the way most people were printing the old tabloid version anyhow, and it's all Meg and I at the Safe Zone project had been doing. Sorry it took so long. Okay. A lot of people have been pushing for me to remove the anatomical sex continuum and reference sex assigned at birth only. Others really find the benefit of discussing the variations of anatomical sex using continua and have argued for that for years. I've listened in on this, tinkering with lots of versions of the genderbread persona that reflect each side of the debate, and tested both a bunch in the classroom and heard from lots of you doing the same, and here's why I finally landed. Like so many social justice things, this isn't an either-or situation, it's a both and one. Contrasting between one's sex assigned at birth and one's anatomical sex, it turns out, is really helpful for a lot of people to better grasp the idea of sex. Sometimes we're talking about sex assigned at birth, and a lot of other times we're talking about the anatomical sex that someone embodies. Okay, one issue I'm coming up through here is that they're conflating sex and gender again. Okay. Let me check. Let's see, I don't know if... Yeah, it's not going to have... Okay. So... between the gender and attraction continuum of identity does not equal sign expression, does not equal sign sex. Okay. Like, it's just this constant reference to sex in where gender is more relevant to the discussion, because sex, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it's, as far as I understand it, it's not super important to the discussion. So we'll just go back to this. I mean, I agree with most of this. This seems like a good model for people to understand the various flavors of social identity.
Genders and identities as a catch-all, effectively giving the message that anyone who doesn't fit in exclusively masculine or feminine appearances must be some sort of other magical gender. Or how about examples of gender radicals calling for violence? Again, this is something which I've featured a lot in my previous videos. Well, for some of these, you can actually put a face on them, such as the bearded trans woman who goes by the name of Kathy Brennan online. But there are also public protests with banners pushing violent messages and even displays, such as one in San Francisco back in 2018 shown here, with seemingly little backlash from the community at large.
One like, though. Well, I guess this one got 110 likes, but that's over 2 years. I mean, there's a lot of bash the turf rhetoric, just like there's bash the fashion, that kind of thing, and it's not good optics. But you kind of gotta, like, understand that there are some people who just are sick of basically being marginalized by TERFs and those who follow TERF ideology and wanting to crack back at them. So while I will state unequivocally this is bad optics and should not be something people do, I understand why they do it. But again, like Mayo side jokes, like ACAB, like a lot of lefty buzzwords, maybe save this for the group chats and the DSA meetings and less for social media, just from an optics perspective.
The narratives pushed by these accounts don't come from nowhere. They are simply further mouthpieces which highlight what is already becoming mainstream within the community itself. Whether you call them TRAs or gender radicals or whatever, if they hit the 5 points that I previously mentioned, that there are many genders, biological sex is a construct, smash the binary.
Okay, anyone, for the last time, I'm not going to talk about this again. Anyone who says biological sex is a construct is misunderstanding the argument. It's not that biological sex is a construct. Biological sex is, as far as I understand it, real. It's just A, not a binary, and B, not that important to gender. But other than that, yeah, anyone who believes if we replace biological sex as a construct with gender is a construct, then yeah, this is all based and gender pilled. Awesome.
Binary. Don't assume someone's gender, and being accompanied by left-wing politics, that is who I am talking about. Now, it doesn't matter if it's someone prominent like Kat Blaque or a Twitter account with only 10 followers. It's the same narratives, and they are the ones that are being listened to and ultimately implementing change that myself and many others strongly disagree with. Now, as a side note, Kat...
Notice how she's not really giving any examples of times when these 10 Twitter follower activists in scare quotes, have affected real-world change. Because, like, there have definitely been, like, anti-fascist Twitter campaigns to get people deplatformed or fired if they participate in fascist organizations. That's good. But I'm not aware of any Twitter dogpiles getting people to change things. The closest I can think of is the Sonic movie, where a bunch of social media backlash all across the spectrum caused them to change it. And I still tend to believe the conspiracy theory that they knew the initial look was going to be bad and rejected, and so they had already worked on the change and were going to do it, but they wanted to kind of test the waters, and then they could look like they listened to fans when they changed it. I still think there's some merit to that. No evidence. I'm not going to say there's evidence, but... So, that seems... That's the only time I can think of where social media backlash caused a significant change, and that didn't have anything to do with trans people. You give me a single example of when trans people dogpiled someone on Twitter and caused a significant real-world change? Was there some ad campaign that got changed, or some slogan that got changed? I don't remember anything off the top of my head.
Mentioned that to transphobes there's no difference between someone like me and, say, this. But this is just another example of an attempt to group everyone in.
This is the problem with your rhetoric. You're basically giving a pass to people who are like you, but completely invalidating anyone who is not as passing or who has not transitioned as much as you do. And those are the people who need help the most. If you said you weren't trans and just said, yeah, I was born a woman, no one would be able to gainsay you. if they didn't know who you were. Like, if you walked into a bar in North Carolina, everyone would call you Miss and Ma'am all night. You would not get misgendered. But someone like Jessica Unive, who's somewhat of a piece of shit, doesn't have that luxury. This is what we're trying to change. That facial hair and being built, having short hair, these are not signifiers of gender. They shouldn't be. They are in our current society, but given how many women, cis women, can grow facial hair, it really should not be a signifier of men. It should just be that you're human and generally an adult.
Into the same box. I can guarantee you from personal experience that many people who are labelled transphobes do indeed see the difference between someone like me and Blair and someone like Travis Alabanza, Alex Drummond or Rachel McKinnon. People like me are just trying to live our lives. The others get their life's purpose from queering society's expectations. Ultimately, the definition of a trans activist is somebody who pushes a particular radical narrative. When I use the phrase trans activist or gender radical or anyone else, that is entirely who I am talking about. That they are still pushing activism because they are still pushing a message online and people are listening to them, whether you like it or not. But what do you think of this video? Please let me know in the
I think this video was shit, because you're basically saying that anyone who believes in current gender theory is a trans activist. And I think my understanding of activism tells me that there needs to be some sort of deliberate action to be considered a trans activist. That you can't be oopsed into being an activist, like you have to take action. Now, someone like Kat Blaque kind of got pushed into being an activist by, the content, by her content, by what she talks about, that kind of thing. But just because you're trans on Twitter and talk about how gender is a social construct and we need to eat the rich and there's more than two genders, and what were the 5 things you listed for gender radical, which you've also conflated with gender activism? Just because that's the case, those people are not activists. Not unless they try to be. Probably the worst video I've done of hers just because of how dishonest and conflationary it was, and that's saying something. Jeez, Rose of Dawn, you are, real bad. Super cringe. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you liked it, like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you. See you next time.